She also learned spycraft during that underground period. I mentioned out of the book Harriet Tubman, Secret Agent, written by a former CIA agent who marvels at her accomplishments. He mentions certain things that she learned. So, for example, if two spies must meet, they try to set up a meeting in a way that puts only one of them in danger. Harriet did this by having escaping slaves meet her 7 or 8 miles from their cabins. Chances were that anyone spotting their escape would capture them before they reached Harriet. Another technique that she learned was the cutout. No, it didn't have to do with paper and scissors. When cautious spy wants to get a message or a document to a contact or to a partner, he or she does not set up a meeting. Instead, arrangements are made for a third person, a cutout, to make the pickup from one spy and deliver to the other. In this way, if the spy is being followed, he or she does not lead the follower to the second spy. Okay? And he lists a bunch of other things that she learned during her Underground Railroad. I mean, she didn't read a book on spycraft. She couldn't read or write. Okay? And she did not get tutored on spycraft. She learned these, okay, out of experiences, hit and miss, trial and error kinds of things. Okay. So let me jump from there to the second phase, and that is her experiences with John Brown and the raid on Harpers Ferry. Now, she met with John Brown several times in planning the raid on Harpers Ferry. She first met him in New York, in Canada at St. Catharines. Now, she was up in Canada because of the Fugitive Slave Act. She couldn't stay in the States. So she moved to Canada. And she also brought slaves to Canada so that they wouldn't be caught. Okay? And there was a community at the time in St. Catharines of at least 1,000 to 1,500 freed slaves. So John Brown went up there first to meet her. He later met her in New York City to plan it too. But anyhow, let me just say a few words about John Brown, which will give you some context for this, for their meeting and their plans together. You have heard of Bleeding Kansas? Okay. The Kansas-Missouri Compromise of 1850? Okay, all right, good. Yeah. For those of you who have not, then let me just give you a very brief explanation. Okay, in the Compromise of 1850, it was basically whether Kansas was going to be a free state or a slave state. Missouri was located right next to Kansas, as you know, and that was a slave state. Okay, so which way would it go? Now, abolitionists sent a lot of persons, including John Brown, into Kansas, since there was going to be a vote on it. Okay? And up from the south and across the river from Missouri, or as when I lived in Missouri, they used to say, Missouri? Mizzou? Anyhow, I forgot what they said, but anyhow, it wasn't Missouri. Missouri, that's it, Missouri. Anyhow, so they came in from Missouri into Kansas, right? And sometimes they brought slaves, but they were mostly household slaves. So they didn't usually set up like plantations like we're in Missouri. But anyhow, there were conflicts between the two. There were areas in which the free staters or the anti-slavery persons lived, like Lawrence, Kansas, Topeka, Kansas, and other areas where the pro-slavery folks lived, like Kansas City. And that is Kansas City on the Kansas side, not the Missouri side. And so when I say there were conflicts, I mean that they fought each other. They raided each other. Okay? They killed each other. John Brown and his sons, okay, were, how shall I say, militant. They would hunt down slave owners or persons who were sympathetic to slavery. And I can tell you two brief instances. Well, one time they caught a family of persons who had raided a anti-slavery town and had killed some people there. John Brown went to their home with his son and a few other folks, right? They hauled out the father and the oldest brother, right? And they offed them, literally. I mean, just, these guys were not armed. They just stabbed them with a sword, all right? That happened in several other instances like that. Now, in order to understand that, you have to understand that John Brown waged guerrilla warfare against slave owners and sympathizers, both in Kansas and into Missouri. This was, how should I say, animated by John Brown's religious views on slavery and on gender equality. They were biblical. John Brown was extremely religious, okay? And his religion was based on the Old Testament. It was very simple. Slavery was forbidden by God, therefore, slave owners or slave sympathizers were sinners. And how do you deal with sinners? An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Okay? Unless, of course, they repented and released all their slaves or something like that, you know. But if they didn't, as far as John Brown is concerned, he was the avenging angel. He was the holy warrior. Yeah.
Was he unusual in those times?
You have to speak up loud, my hearing is...
Was he unusual?
Unusual? No. I mean, I'd say yes and no.
He was very talented.
There were obviously other abolitionists who did not believe that and who thought that somehow that through legislation or other things like that, that slavery would end. He did not. He believed slavery would end by freeing the slaves directly. And I'll get into this a little bit more. But John Brown and Harriet Tubman were instant friends when they met. When John Brown met Harriet Tubman, his first words out of his mouth was, "Hello, General." All right? And he always referred to her as General. And this is significant because he referred to himself and all his militia referred to him as Captain. Right? And calling her a general indicated that her military theory, strategy, and tactics were superior to his.
That's right.
And that was quite a statement coming from John Brown because he did have an inflated ego. But anyhow, yeah, I'm just going until the end.
Go ahead.
You know?
Go.
We want to hear it.
Okay, good.
We're almost at the raid here. So Harriet Tubman's view, and there's her religious view, her moral view, and her anti-slavery view coincided with John Brown. I mean, they were best buddies. They got along well. Okay? They admired each other. In fact, I would say of all abolitionists, Harriet Tubman was closer to John Brown in terms of her thinking and so forth than to any other abolitionist. Now, they did plan this raid on Harpers Ferry, and the idea was to attack slavery at the root. That is, freed slaves so that they could become fighters, if possible, against slavery, and that they could move to a liberated territory as a base of operations from which they could conduct their activities. They both agreed on that, and that's what the basis for why they planned together. Their planning included Harriet's view of the area that John Brown wanted to use. That is, he wanted to raid Harpers Ferry, okay, in Virginia, which is now, I think, part of West Virginia. And Harpers Ferry was the second largest arsenal in the United States, Springfield being the largest, but it produced the latest rifles, okay, in the United States, so the most advanced. And I'd say even the most advanced compared to European weaponry at the time. We wanted to raid it, take the weapons, and then move up into the Alleghenies and form a territory, a liberated territory, all right, in which there was a proclamation about how they would live and so on and so forth, and use that territory to raid plantations and to draw slaves into that territory and to form other liberated territories in the South. He got that idea, he didn't just dream it up. He got that idea from the Haitian Revolution and also from reading about the Maroons in Jamaica. Harriet Tubman agreed with him, all right? And John Brown only had experience working on the, or I say fighting on the plains of Kansas. The forested hills were quite different, which she knew. Okay, and since she knew that, I mean, since she knew about the forest and so forth because of her previous experience, she tutored him on how to survive, how to do everything that she did on the Underground Railroad, basically, okay, in order to elude the United States military.
Which year are you talking about at this?
After 1859. Harriet even suggested that he conduct the raid on July 4th. But unfortunately, he didn't get enough men in time to conduct that raid. Harriet also helped him recruit soldiers or troops for his raid. And of the 21 persons that were on the raid, including a couple of John Brown's kids, 6 were recruited from Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman, John Brown wanted Harriet Tubman to go on the raid with him because, you know, she might show him things on the maps and, you know, stuff like that, but he felt more comfortable if she was along. Okay? However, when the time, just before the raid began, and he tried to find her, he couldn't. She happened to be at the time in New Bedford, Massachusetts, in a hospital undergoing treatment for her recurring illness, dealing with epilepsy and associated things that constantly kept cropping up in her life and slowing her down. So he put out a call for her but the call never got to her. The call was through abolitionists. Now, I read several sources that claim that abolitionists, or a lot of abolitionists, I'll put it that way, that he put the call out to, or told her to contact Harriet, that they did not favor his raid. And so they did not get the message. They just kept telling John Brown, we can't find her, we can't find her, right? But she was laid up at the time, so she didn't show up. Now, you see the picture of John Brown's raid up there on Harpers Ferry. He failed.
Yes.
You do know he failed, right? Okay. So, if Harriet Tubman had been along, there are two tactical errors that John Brown made that I'm certain if she was along that she would have corrected. Okay? The first tactical error was that a train went through Harpers Ferry on the way to D.C., a passenger train. They stopped the train. Okay? Actually, they detained the train. The train stopped at Harpers Ferry, okay? They detained the train. The smart thing that John Brown did was to shut down the telegraph in Harpers Ferry, okay? So they detained the train, and then John Brown let it go. And it was only about an hour or so to D.C., right? So all these people on the train, right, who see that mayhem is going on at Harpers Ferry, they go to D.C. Word gets out, right? And so in D.C., they send up Robert E. Lee. Okay? Robert E. Lee and a detachment of Marines from the Marine barracks in D.C., right? They jump on the train and go to Harpers Ferry. Now, John Brown had some skirmishes with the militias in Harpers Ferry. Okay, and one of the persons in the Virginia militia was Aaron Burr, who actually was right at that point of fighting with him. So John Brown decides to stick around and fight, and he goes into a firehouse, right? And eventually is surrounded by the Marines, right? And the people that he was using to fight, I mean, most of them never had fought before. Some had fought in guerrilla raids in Kansas. But on a conventional fight against disciplined forces, they were no match, and they were overcome. And of course, John Brown was captured and defeated. Now, those two errors, letting the train go, and the word getting out, and sticking around and fighting rather than taking all the weapons that they had and hightailing it up to the hills for their liberated territory, those two errors, I would submit, if Harriet Tubman was there, she would not have let that happen. Okay? Now again, I can't prove it, but knowing her, let's say, her wisdom about these matters, she knew that these were errors that would lead to defeat. Okay? That's all I want to say about that. Now, let me talk about the Civil War experience. Next.
Okay.
Like I said, she was a military commander, a spy, a scout, and also a nurse. She also, and John Brown, basically had two theories about war and slavery. In my own words, in my own explanation of her views, she saw slavery as a mode of production of chattel slavery. Okay? Chattel slavery was a mode of production. Okay? Now, the forces of production, of course, besides the implements that slaves used, were the slaves themselves. The relations of production, of course, were the slave owners and the slaves, right? And, of course, the product, cotton, rice, whatever else it was produced, okay? And, of course, the profits that came from that production. Mm-hmm. Now, basically, she saw the abolition of slavery and its replacement by wage labor. She was not a socialist, okay? All right? In other words, slaves would be free, but they would become paid laborers themselves. Okay? So, how do you destroy a mode of production in which they don't voluntarily want to give up? That is, which the slave owners don't want to voluntarily give up their status. Well, I mean, you all know by now from what I've said, right, as to what she believed in. Okay, so you would destroy them physically where necessary, or in the social sense if they somehow voluntarily gave up slavery. Well, they didn't voluntarily give up slavery, so obviously there was only one solution. And that led to the second thing that I want to mention about Harriet, in which she, along with John Brown, believed, and that was total war. She felt that it would be a total war against slavery if you're going to get rid of it as an institution, as a mode of production. Okay. Now, total war means to destroy not just soldiers, okay, but also the sources and infrastructure of slavery, the supplies, the crops, the livestock, the homes, and where civilians resist civilians. Okay, it was total war, as opposed to, quote, conventional war, which you just destroy other people's military and leave civilians alone. What would be saved were only those things that could be used by the Union forces. You know, if crops could be used, or certain kinds of mills could be used, all right, they would be saved. But otherwise, everything was destroyed. Now, this was considered uncivilized at the time. And the proper Union generals and proper abolitionists, who were sometimes Union generals, described this not only as uncivilized, but as bushwhacking, as an Indian style of warfare. Okay. And so it, however, had redeeming values in the Civil War, because what else was Sherman's march to the sea? It was a total war. It was a total destruction of slavery at the roots. Okay? It was a laying waste of the land, driving off of the people. Okay? And that's what broke the back of the Confederacy. Now, so you have the time.
It's
So
quarter
who
to
came up
12.
with this plan? Anaconda
I
Plan.
can't see up there.
Oh,
Oh,
Anaconda.
okay, hold on a minute, Rob. It is now 11:46.
Okay. I'm almost at the end. Won't seem like it, but I am.
No, go and make your point. We still have some slides.
Yeah. So, and just as a quick aside, how many people here saw Glory? All right. You remember in Glory, there's a group, there's an officer who is actually Colonel Montgomery, who I'll mention later, who was a lieutenant in John Brown's militia. And he led some of the forces that Harriet was connected with. In that movie, they portray him, that is Montgomery, as the Kansas villain. Remember, there's this one soldier who leads these black troops, and they loot, and they burn down places, right? They run off, terrorize civilians, right? And they are portrayed in the movie
As the bad
negatively
guys.
compared with the general who ran the Massachusetts 54th, which was a civilized, conventional group, which Gloria was all about. Okay? They fought soldiers. They didn't fight civilians. They didn't fight slave owners. They didn't attempt to lay waste to the property of slave owners, except for, of course, saving the slaves, but all the other property they lay waste to. Okay. Anyhow, when the Civil War came along, Harriet Tubman, who actually predicted the Civil War, okay, and she tried to get Lincoln involved in the war, involved in fighting, because she felt that that was the only way to do it after the Confederacy split. And Lincoln wouldn't talk to her, but she spoke with his wife a lot, Mary Todd Lincoln. And Mary Todd Lincoln was sympathetic to her. And the Secretary of State, Seward, who was also sympathetic to her, they tried to convince Lincoln, but of course Lincoln wouldn't, because Lincoln felt it would be too great a divide. He was worried that the border states, which were Union states, that were slave states at the same time, but who didn't break off with the Confederacy, he felt like, well, they'd break off with the Confederacy and we'd have more opposition and, blah, blah. I mean, he had a lot of reasons why, although eventually he did get to that point of fighting and of the proclamation ending slavery, and finally of the allowing blacks to serve in the Union Army. Okay. Now, the initial strategy of the Union was the Anaconda Plan, as you see up here, which was a blockade entirely, on this side, I guess, a blockade that went from Maryland, Virginia, all the way down around Florida to the Gulf Coast, and then up the Mississippi River. And it was to prevent the South from either sending out mainly cotton to England or receiving supplies from abroad. It was also designed, especially on the East Coast, to conduct raids from ships into the South. And a number of raids were done mainly in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. Now, in the South, let me see, what's the next? There was a program called the Point Royal experiment. Point Royal was an island. It was part of the Sea Islands, okay, off the coast of South Carolina, and Georgia. Okay? Harriet was located in the main, where the main forces of the Union were, an island here which they captured, the Union captured early on in the war, okay, and in which they could conduct raids, okay, and
Now,
the
can you
coast.
tell us what states we're looking at there? I mean,
South Carolina.
it's all South Carolina.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And the distance here to the mainland, right, was, I would say, not too far, not too much of a distance from Alameda to Oakland. It's very close. Maybe about, at the most, at the closest point, maybe a mile, half a mile, something like that, very close. So she went into the Sea Islands, and she was sent by Governor Andrews. And that was the so-called Port Royal Island experiment, which essentially sent abolition teachers and others who into Port Royal, and they set up schools. They set up land for the freedmen to work on. And they set up programs for women to teach them tailoring, baking, and other skills which they would use to, like, feed the Union troops, sew their uniforms, and stuff like that, in which they would get paid for it. Okay? And the men who worked the land under the supervision of the Northerners, okay, were paid for what they produced on the land, right? And then what they produced on the land was sold up north, right, for a profit, right? They became wage laborers initially. So another characteristic, well, one of the characteristics is the location of the Sea Islands. Okay, remember, Sea Islands go all the way around here, all the way down to Georgia. The Sea Islands, and in particular the ones around South Carolina, were very tropical. And this also applied to the coast. The weather was extremely hot, humid, especially in the summer. And malaria, dysentery were rife. There were a lot of salt marshes, or sea salt marshes, as you went into here, okay, until you reached a higher area, which the marshes turned into freshwater marshes. There were a lot of cypress trees, okay, forests of cypress trees with moss hanging on them, you know, all the rest of it. Now, that's one aspect. The plantation owners tried to spend as little time in that environment, particularly in the spring and summer, as possible. They went off to their mini mansions in Charleston and Savannah. And the plantation owners in South Carolina were among the richest in the South. Now, what was produced in that area was not primarily cotton, but rice. Okay? And cotton was secondary and less amount of production. Okay. So there was very little contact compared to other areas of the South between the slave owners and the slaves in that area in South Carolina than, say, further south. Now, that's one. The second thing to note, in regards to the Africans who were brought over, they were experienced in rice production. They came from the so-called rice coast of Africa. That is Angola, Gabon, Congo, Nigeria. Okay, they came from the coastal areas of those countries, or not for now countries, okay, whose main crop was rice. And so they were specifically brought over for the purpose of working the rice in those areas. And of course, rice fed the troops. So,